I remember standing in a dimly lit room with a woman named Sarah, who hadn't spoken a single word in nearly 4 days. Her breathing was shallow, and her family had already said their final goodbyes, expecting her to simply drift away in her sleep. But then, something shifted that felt completely impossible. Sarah's eyes suddenly snapped open, filled with a clarity I hadn't seen in months, and she began staring intensely at a specific, empty corner of the room. Her daughter immediately leaned in, desperate for one last connection, but Sarah wasn't looking at her. She was focused on something else entirely, her lips curling into a soft, recognizing smile that didn't match the heavy grief in the air. Most families see this and think the brain is finally failing or the medication has taken over. They try to pull the patient back to the present, but I've learned that this specific look isn't confusion at all. What I saw in Sarah's eyes wasn't the frantic fear of delirium. It was a profound sense of relief, as if she were greeting an old friend who had just walked through the door. If this were just a random chemical malfunction in the mind, these visions would be chaotic and frightening. Yet they always follow a strict, almost beautiful pattern. Why does the mind choose these specific visitors at the very end, and why does it happen with such haunting consistency? The family usually freezes when this happens. They look at me with wide, searching eyes, hoping for a medical explanation that makes sense of the sudden change. They whisper about the morphine or the end-stage agitation they read about online, desperately trying to pull Sarah back to their world, back to a conversation she can no longer have. It's a natural instinct to want to ground someone we love, but in those moments, the room feels divided between two different realities. They see a woman losing her grip, but I see someone who has finally found something solid. This is where the clinical labels start to fall apart for me. If this were just a random brain malfunction, Sarah's visions would be chaotic, frightening, or completely nonsensical, like a dream that doesn't have a map. But that's not what happens. Patients across different cultures start seeing the same types of visitors and hearing the same comforting messages, almost as if they're following a hidden script. Why does the mind, in its most fragile state, suddenly become so orderly and specific? It makes you wonder if we've been calling it a breakdown simply because we're afraid. And here is the most curious part that almost no one understands until they've seen it firsthand. For weeks, Sarah had been drifting in a fog, barely aware of her own name. Yet, the moment she looked into that empty corner, she seemed more present than she had in a month. It wasn't life leaving. It felt like a surge of clarity arriving. If the brain is failing, why does the person inside suddenly wake up right before the end? What's actually happening in those final hours is far more organized than you've been told. When you sit by the bed long enough, you notice a very specific physical shift that usually begins in the quietest hours. The patient's breathing might change, becoming rhythmic, a sound that often terrifies families, but is actually just the body's natural way of letting go. But then, the stillness is suddenly broken. A patient who hasn't moved in days will slowly turn their head and lock their eyes onto a specific point in the corner. They aren't just glancing, they are staring with an intensity that feels incredibly real. This is where the pattern becomes truly haunting. It's rarely a random spot on the wall. It's almost always toward the ceiling or a doorway. You might see their lips move in a silent conversation, or they might reach out a trembling hand as if touching someone standing right there. To a bystander, it looks like the brain is finally short-circuiting. But if you look closer, you don't see frantic eyes. You see the focused expression of someone recognizing a face they haven't seen in decades. This phenomenon follows a sequence so predictable, it's almost like a scheduled appointment. They might name a parent who passed away 40 years ago, or mention a sibling they haven't seen in years. It's not a chaotic hallucination. It's always familiar people, and it feels like a homecoming. This raises a question medical textbooks often avoid. If the mind is truly breaking down, why does it become so specific and orderly right before the end? It makes you wonder if we're the ones actually missing the full picture. When a family sees their loved one reaching into thin air or whispering to a wall, the first thing they feel is a sharp, cold wave of panic. They often assume the pain has finally become unbearable, or that the high doses of medication have fractured the person's mind beyond repair. It looks like a total loss of control, a chaotic slide into a dark, confused place where their mother or father is no longer present. They desperately want to fix the moment, thinking something has gone terribly wrong. In the medical world, we often slap the label of terminal restlessness or delirium on these exact behaviors to make them feel manageable and clinical. We tell families it's just the brain's chemistry shifting as the organs begin to slow down, and we might even offer more sedation to quiet the movements. But if you look past the clinical chart, you'll notice something that contradicts the idea of suffering. While true delirium is usually frantic and terrifying, this specific state is strangely quiet, focused, and almost destination-driven. But here is the point where the common understanding of death completely falls apart for anyone watching closely. What looks like the brain finally failing and losing its grip is actually the moment the person inside seems to wake up with more clarity than they've had in weeks. It feels less like a mind that is breaking and more like a mind that is finally arriving somewhere familiar. And that's the part that changes everything we thought we knew about the end. It's not a breakdown, it's an arrival. When we look at these final moments, it's easy to assume the mind is simply shutting down like a failing machine. But what I've witnessed suggests a much more organized transition. Instead of a chaotic decline, the level of consciousness often follows a wave-like pattern. A patient might be unresponsive for hours, only to suddenly surface with profound awareness. It's as if the fog clears just long enough for them to recognize a face, proving the person inside hasn't disappeared. But what about the physical signs that look so much like struggle? One of the most misunderstood parts of this process is the change in breathing. To a family, the rhythmic, heavy sound can be distressing, sounding like a struggle for air. We often call this terminal congestion, but it's actually just the body's way of relaxing the muscles that usually clear the throat. The patient isn't in distress. They are breathing in a way that requires the least amount of effort. It's a physical letting go, a shift into a slower tempo. Yet, as the breath slows, the body begins to show another sign. You might notice the skin on their hands beginning to change color, turning a mottled purple or becoming cooler. In a medical setting, we call this decreased circulation. But in the room, it looks like the body is withdrawing its energy back to the core. It's not a sign of pain. It's the physical shell finishing its work, so the focus can shift elsewhere. It's a visual map of the journey inward. But even as the body cools, the most startling part of the pattern is about to reveal itself. When you step back and see these three elements, the clarity of mind, the rhythmic breath, and the cooling of the body, you realize this isn't a series of accidents. It's a highly synchronized, orderly sequence that every human body is programmed to follow. We spend so much time fearing the breakdown that we miss the incredible intelligence behind the departure. The body knows exactly how to finish its story, and it does so with a precision that should bring us comfort. But it's what happens in the very last moments that truly challenges our understanding. I remember a patient named Thomas, a man who had spent his final week in a deep, unresponsive state. His family sat by his side, mourning a man they thought had already left them behind. Then, in the middle of a quiet afternoon, Thomas did something that defied every medical expectation we had recorded. He sat up slightly, his eyes focusing with a piercing intensity on the empty space near the ceiling, a place where only shadows should have been. His wife gasped, reaching for his hand, assuming this was a final, painful seizure or a terrifying hallucination. She kept calling his name, trying to anchor him to the room, but Thomas didn't look at her. Instead, a look of profound, joyful recognition swept over his face, erasing years of illness in a single second. He whispered a name, his sister, who had passed away decades ago, as if she were standing right there. It wasn't the frantic reaching of a confused man. It was a peaceful greeting. What made this moment haunt me wasn't just the vision, but a detail that felt impossible. Thomas turned to his wife, his voice suddenly clear, and described exactly what his sister was wearing, a specific blue dress from a childhood photo no one had looked at in decades. In that moment, the fear in the room vanished. The family realized he wasn't lost in a nightmare. He was being escorted. This wasn't a brain short-circuiting. It was a person being guided through a very specific, orderly transition. Most people would say Thomas was just experiencing a chemical glitch, but that explanation feels hollow when you're actually in the room. If it's just a malfunction, why does it bring such a specific, unshakable peace instead of terror? He fell back into a deep sleep minutes later, but the atmosphere had changed from tragedy to profound mystery. We often think the end is about losing everything. But for Thomas, it looked like he was finally gaining a clarity that the rest of us simply couldn't see yet. We spend our lives fearing the moment the light goes out, imagining a chaotic struggle where everything we are simply disappears into the dark. But when you witness this pattern over and over, you begin to see that death isn't a medical failure or a tragic breakdown of the machine. It is a transition as carefully orchestrated as birth, a final act of intelligence by a body that knows exactly how to let go. Those visitors in the corner and that sudden surge of clarity aren't glitches. They are part of a profound, quiet homecoming that we were never taught to recognize. Understanding this doesn't just change how we sit at the bedside, it changes how we carry our own fear of the unknown. When we stop trying to fix the dying process and instead start observing the peace it brings, the wall we've always seen at the end of life begins to look much more like a doorway. It turns out the mind isn't losing its way. It's finally finding it. If you've ever felt this shift or seen a loved one reach for something you couldn't see, I invite you to share that experience below so we can continue to look at these final moments with more wonder than weight. In the end, the most beautiful thing I've learned is that no one ever seems to go alone. The room may look empty to us, but for those making the journey, it is finally beautifully full.